States became interested in the World War when the British passenger liner the Lusitania was torpedoed and sunk just off the Irish coast in May of 1915. Thanks to changes in the law that had been made in the wake of the sinking of the Titanic 3 years earlier, maritime regulations did require that there be enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew. The Lusitania, therefore, was prepared to evacuate its entire complement of souls on board. However, there was still tremendous loss of life because the Lusitania sank in just 20 minutes and had begun listing extremely badly soon after being torpedoed, rendering half of its lifeboats useless almost immediately. The German claims that the Lusitania was a legitimate target because it was illegally carrying ammunition in violation of numerous international treaties about the rules of warfare and passenger liners, a charge that the British Admiralty denied. Although in reality, there were boxes of ammunition on board. Some thought that exploding ammunition contributed to the massive explosion and rapid sinking of the ship, but modern explorations of the wreck have revealed boxes still intact. It's actually believed that the torpedo hit the engine room, and more importantly, near either a boiler or an empty coal bunker, which triggered an explosion that rapidly sent the ship to the bottom. 128 Americans were among the dead, and fearing the United States entering the war soon, Germany made a promise not to target passenger liners, even if it was suspected that those passenger liners were carrying contraband. The promise, though, would only last a few months. Just a few months after the Lusitania, another British passenger liner, the Arabic, was torpedoed and sunk, resulting in the deaths of a few more Americans, and yet another promise not to sink unarmed passenger liners. Approximately 6 months after that, it happened yet again, this time to a French ship, the Sussex, resulting in yet another pledge by the German government in an effort to keep the Americans out of the war. Despite assurances from President Wilson not to get involved in the war, and as he'd been running on his election campaign in 1916 and had won, the military still had been undergoing a reorganization, and the U.S. had entered a period that he called watchful waiting. He expanded both the Army and the National Guard, and established a reserve officer training corps as well as an aviation wing in the United States Army. The Army was actively recruiting and increasing their numbers, though there was not yet a draft, though military leaders did initially propose one in late 1960. But the United States still was not ready for a requirement of armed services because the United States was at peace. But that would change soon. In early 1917, British intelligence intercepted a message sent from Germany to Mexico, proposing a military alliance between the two nations in the event that the United States decided to enter the war. The idea was for the presence of Mexico to prevent the United States from providing any effective assistance to the Allied nations in Europe, since the U.S. would have to defend against possible invasion. Since Germany was confident that they were about to win the war, they would see to it in the eventual peace negotiations that Mexico, for its trouble, would receive Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. Americans were outraged upon learning of this proposal from Arthur Zimmerman to the Mexican government, and many began to demand that the United States end its neutrality and enter the war. Not long after the United States government received information about the Zimmerman note, Germany announced its intention to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, since that would hurt their enemies, especially Britain, the most, and hopefully bring about a quick victory, certainly a victory before the United States could provide effective assistance. Though he had promised not to get involved in the war, the combination of these two things, unrestricted submarine and warfare, and the Zimmerman note, prompted the president to bow to the increasing demands of the people. He felt he had no other choice but to ask Congress for a declaration of war.
On April 2, 1917, President Wilson asked for a declaration of war.
4 days later, he got it. And as the popular song of the day went, "The Yanks are coming, and we won't come back till it's over, over there." The rapid process of mobilizing America's forces quickly began. Almost immediately after declaring war, military advisors were granted that draft. All men between the ages of 21 and 30 were required to register for military service, although you still had to actually be drafted and cleared to serve first. Medical conditions, injuries, and even certain occupations could sometimes render you unfit for actual service. Draft ages were later expanded to ages 18 to 45. And just because you were drafted didn't mean you'd actually be sent to war. Only about 2.2 million of the 4 million men who served were draftees, and only about half of the entire army was ultimately sent to Europe. One thing that was different about this war is that you couldn't buy a substitute, nor could you buy an exemption. And women were also encouraged to join the armed forces for the first time, with more than 11,000 joining the Navy alone. In addition to getting enough men, the Council of National Defense also created the War Industries Board to oversee factory production, setting prices, wages, and quotas, and placing limits on businesses in order to improve efficiency and to keep costs in check. The efforts of the War Industries Board led to a 20% increase in industrial output within 18 months, a practically unheard of increase. And now that you had all those goods, you had to get them to where they needed to be. The War Shipping Board oversaw the transportation of all goods needed for the military and for the Allies. To improve efficiency, the railroads were taken over by the government and run as one large system, so as to not waste time or fuel confining shipments to track only owned by one company. It also oversaw the expansion of both the merchant marine and even the United States Navy, as America's shipyards bloomed to life, producing ships quickly, sometimes in as little as 3 weeks. Shipyards would run shifts 24 hours a day with 3 8-hour work shifts in order to generate enough capacity to the war effort. This was about a 1,000% increase over what they'd had before declaring war. And with German U-boats targeting ships bound for the British Isles, the goal was to build the merchant ships faster than they could be sunk. And to make it more difficult to sink cargo ships bound for Europe, convoys were arranged with small, fast warships called destroyers providing protections. Submarines weren't particularly fast, and they could be chased and sunk by the destroyers if they attempted to attack a convoy. America's farmers were encouraged to expand production as well, with the Food Administration, run by future President Herbert Hoover, offering a very high price of $2 a bushel for all grain crops. And some grain crops had just recently been selling for as little as 50 cents a bushel, so this is a tremendous increase. Just about every farmer had some acreage lying fallow, meaning not in use, that could be planted with a late crop in 1917 or to expand their production in 1918. Meanwhile, civilians were encouraged to hooverize and find substitutes for the farm products that could then go to the Army and to the Allies. The system worked, and food exports doubled by 1918, which, keep in mind, is roughly one growing season. The idea of hooverizing was also carried out with regards to energy sources, and it was overseen by the Fuel Administration. Americans were encouraged to reduce their use of energy by going without various types of fuel, especially coal, oil, and gas, which could be used by both the Navy and the Army. All of these mobilization efforts, as well as the fighting of the war itself, was going to be quite expensive, but the United States government was able to raise a tremendous amount of money to support its military efforts. Several series of bonds were released that Americans could purchase, and most were oversubscribed, meaning they sold more than they had originally planned. Bonds work with the consumer purchasing a bond at a reduced price. For example, a $10 bond would cost you $5, giving the government cash to use now. In the future, often 7 to 10 years, you would be repaid the full value of the bond, which would be $10 for the $10 bond that you had actually only paid $5 for. So that $10 then, using our example, included the initial purchase plus interest. In addition to the bond sales, new taxes were instituted, and together the United States was able to pay for all of their expenses, as well as loan billions of dollars to the Allies, who generally turned around and purchased American-made goods. Because military recruiting wasn't going as quickly as officials had planned in the first few months of the war, George Creel was appointed as head of the Committee on Public Information, which had the goal of selling Americans on participation in the war effort. He hired thousands of speakers to give thousands more speeches all around the country to try and convince Americans that U.S. involvement in the war was necessary and unavoidable. Americans were further encouraged by an extensive propaganda campaign, and even the British joined in to support the Americans. Although there were still problems, the relationship between labor and management generally did well, with minimal fuss or argument. By January of 1918, the United States was finally starting to get men into place in Europe, and President Wilson began drafting his idea for what peace in the post-war world should look like. He came up with what he was calling the 14 points and strongly supported this idea for the remainder of his life. For Americans who didn't seem to want to follow the conventional thoughts of the day, they could be targeted by the Espionage Act or the Sedition Act. Does anybody remember the original Sedition Act back in the 1790s? These laws were mainly directed at individuals stationed in or visiting areas of troop movement and assemblage. There was a continued fear that German or Austrian agents were infiltrating factories and were interfering with industrial production. It was coupled with a rise in anti-German hysteria, largely due to Creel Committee propaganda. There would be rumors of spying and sabotage. Some German Americans were even tarred and feathered. Orchestras found it unsafe to play German music, including Beethoven, and even teaching a German language was discontinued in many schools and colleges. The Espionage Act provided fines and imprisonment for anyone who was aiding the enemy, inciting rebellion in the military, or obstructing draft recruitment. The Sedition Act forbade any criticism of the government, the flag, or of America's soldiers. And it resulted in numerous prosecutions, with anti-war socialists and members of the radical labor union, the International Workers of the World, particularly being targeted. After the war, however, presidential pardons were freely granted, although some victims did stay in jail until the 1930s. In general, Americans supported the war efforts, and this increased tremendously. They did this with both their money and their national spirit, going without so that their soldiers and the Allies could have more of what they needed.
3,000 miles from home, an American army is fighting for you. Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake. Only the hardest blows can win against the enemy we are fighting.
America's naval fleet would be a tremendous asset to the Allies winning the war. American destroyers, the small, fast surface ships that hunted for submarines, and the merchant fleet brought supplies to the Allies. About half of the German subfleet would be destroyed by the United States Navy in the last 12 months of the war. And this allowed the convoy troops ships and the convoy cargo ships to reach the British civilians and their military, bringing the vast supplies that were needed, with very few being lost. The soldiers themselves, the Allied Expeditionary Force, often nicknamed the Doughboys because of their fresh and clean and pale appearance, kind of like fresh bread dough, especially once you compared them to their French and British counterparts who had been fighting in the trenches for several years, exposed to the elements. They began some of this Allied expeditionary force to Europe in 1917, but most of them did not arrive until well into 1918. And in total, about 2 million were sent.